Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Meg Smith, the Executive Vice President of Research Management at the Cure Alzheimer's Fund. Meg graduated with a Bachelor of Science from Duke University and a JD from Harvard Law School. Always passionate about philanthropy, research, and Alzheimer's, Meg joined the Cure Alzheimer's Fund in 2015. Meg, for those who do not know you, can you describe your work and what motivated you to become a part of the Cure Alzheimer's Fund?
Sure. So my role at Cure Alzheimer's Fund is to make sure that we make the best possible scientific decisions when we're putting our funding to work. And what that means is making sure the right people have the right information at the right time so that they can get to the right decision. I myself am not a scientific decision maker. As you just heard from my resume, I don't have a PhD or even a master's in any aspect of science. And we're really proud of our model in which all of our scientific decision-making is actually done by active scientists in the field. People who are on literally the bleeding edge of Alzheimer's research volunteer their time and their thinking and their judgment to help us figure out how to put our donors' dollars to work. But in order to do that efficiently and effectively and accurately, they need to make sure that they have the right information to make the good decisions with. Sorry, my dog just decided to leave the room. So my goal is to make sure that they have what they need at the right time, that they have all of the context for their decision that they might need, and to make sure that we are constantly recruiting the best possible science so that I have the best possible proposals to take to our decision makers. In my role, I get to work really closely with just amazing, fascinating, brilliant scientists. So I'm really lucky that way. But I also get to be a bridge to the rest of our community because one of the other things that we always want to make sure that we're doing is assessing our science to preserve and to pursue our mission. So there's a lot of fascinating science out there that might not lead to a cure for Alzheimer's. It might help us understand brains better, and it's really cool. But our goal is to actually help patients. And that means we support really cool research only if we think it's going to lead to something that will help patients. So in order to make sure we're doing that, after our scientific decision makers go through their process, I go back to our board and I prove that we did actually pursue our scientific decision-making process and it was rigorous. And I also translate what it is we've decided, our scientific decision makers have decided is worth funding, and explain to the board how it actually supports that mission. So the board's job is then to say, okay, we were really rigorous. We did actually hold this science to really high standards, and we believe it will actually help patients. And therefore, yes, we sign off on actually using our donor dollars this way. So I get to have a really active role in that stewardship for our donor resources. And I get to talk constantly to just really fascinating, brilliant people.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think you already touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little more about the process of providing grants and funding for Alzheimer's labs? And also, what kind of research are some of those labs focusing on?
Sure. So our process is a little bit different than some places. Some places put out what you call a request for proposals, and they have a specific scientific project that they want pursued or a question that they want answered. And then they get proposals from all over the place, with ideas for pursuing that. Our job in our model is to follow the science. So we rely on our affiliated scientists, our research leadership group, and our other funded researchers for them to tell us what's important in Alzheimer's right now. And so rather than putting out RFPs, we actually recruit letters of intent where people say to us, this is what I'm passionate about, and this is why, and would you all be interested in a proposal on this? So we don't know in January, for example, what it is we're going to be funding over the course of the year because we don't know what LOIs we're going to get yet, letters of intent, what's going to come in, what great, brilliant ideas are going to drop in our laps. But that's actually part of what makes it really fun and really interesting is we can be very responsive to great new ideas as they arise. If we know somebody has a great track record of doing phenomenal science and they come to us with an idea that's one of those, this could be crazy, but, And we send it out to other experts in the field, and their response is, wow, that is a crazy idea, but it would change everything if it were right. We can get funding into the hands of somebody like that in something like 6 weeks. And that means we didn't have to come up with the idea. We didn't tell them what was important. They told us. And we really like being that kind of reactive, responsive, and fast funding, because it's a real challenge in science to get money for great ideas quickly. So that was the answer to one of your questions. The other question was about the subject matter. We fund across an incredibly broad spectrum of Alzheimer's research because of that model. So of course, we're funding lots of work into how beta amyloid is produced. Are there ways that we could shift that production to shorter, less toxic lengths? Are there ways that we can actually think differently about beta amyloid, and potentially it might have a protective role, and we need to balance managing the toxicity of the longer lengths with the possible beneficial role of shorter lengths? Lots and lots of beta amyloid work, because that's one of the hallmark pathologies of Alzheimer's. We're also, of course, funding lots of work into tau. Tau pathology is what comes along closer in time to the actual emergence of cognitive symptoms. And so a lot of people think that's another opportunity for intervention. So we're funding lots of work on the question of, how does beta amyloid pathology actually induce tau pathology? That's one way that Alzheimer's is different from other tauopathies that don't seem to have a hallmark pathology that triggers tau. We're also funding work in how tau gets seeded. We don't really understand yet how it is that tau pathology propagates across the brain in a very set pattern, but we know that it does. So how is that happening? And are there ways that we could interrupt that so that it didn't spread around the brain? We're, of course, looking a lot at neuroinflammation, which is the reaction of the brain when things go wrong. You need some neuroinflammation. If you get an insult or an injury to the brain, you want your immune system to react and try to fix it. But we know in Alzheimer's and in other neurodegenerative disorders, what you see is neuroinflammation going awry. It either doesn't clean up all the damage that it needs to, or it actually starts attacking and digesting healthy synapses and healthy cells that you do want to preserve. So lots and lots of work into neuroinflammation, particularly because the genetics of late onset classic Alzheimer's, where people are developing it at 65 or older, generally speaking, that very clearly says that neuroinflammation and genes related to neuroinflammation are a big driver of risk. So those are kind of classic, very common categories for Alzheimer's research, but we're also looking at things like cellular senescence. Why is it that some cells that are supposed to continue in the cell cycle, meaning that they keep dividing to proliferate, instead they get frozen, they kind of drop out of the cycle and they become what we call zombie cells. And as zombie cells, they actually secrete cytokines and other inflammatory and essentially toxic chemicals that make other cells turn zombie too. That's why we call them zombies. They really are infectious. But other cells, actually, like neurons, are not supposed to go back. They're never supposed to be in the cell cycle. Once you have a neuron, it doesn't divide anymore. It's supposed to just stay. We know that in Alzheimer's disease, some neurons go back into the cell cycle, and that also is toxic. So why do they do that? And are there ways that we can interrupt that? We're looking at the microbiome. This is actually really fascinating because it's an area of research that's very compelling for other neurodiseases, including psychiatric disorders, that is kind of a brand new frontier. You have lots of different microbiomes in your body. Your skin is a microbiome, for example. You'll hear about, oh, I'm getting acne because my skin is off balance. That's generally speaking a question of your skin microbiome. Well, in Alzheimer's, we're looking at both the brain microbiome, what's in your brain, what's supposed to be in your brain, what's not supposed to be in your brain, and how is your brain reacting to it. But we're also really interested in your gut microbiome. As it turns out, the gut-brain axis derives a lot of Alzheimer's pathology. We know in mice, you can change the gut microbiome and see changes in amyloid pathology, for example. We know that the gut microbiomes of Alzheimer's patients are different both from healthy seniors and from younger people. We don't understand all the whys of that, but it's a really exciting opportunity for intervention because we believe that it's going to be easier to alter your gut microbiome than it's going to be to alter your brain microbiome or to actually alter your brain molecular biology. If you could eat differently or eat something or repopulate or recolonize your gut microbiome by eating certain things, that would be a much easier opportunity than trying to get drugs across the blood-brain barrier, for example. We have projects that are looking at how and why your brain changes in response to exercise. And if we could mimic that pharmacologically, it's always going to be better to actually get that exercise, but it's very challenging to tell somebody who's 70 and has been sedentary for 30 or 40 years to go out and start exercising. So are there ways that we could actually mimic that so that everybody didn't have to try to be a triathlete in their old age? So I could go on and on because we really do have a very broad spectrum of research, but that's one of the really fun things about my job is that I get to see and learn about all kinds of crazy frontiers in Alzheimer's research that, you know, from one year to the next, nobody has thought of, and suddenly we get to fund them.
Thank you so much. It's so great to hear about the research that's ongoing and also the spontaneity that goes along with it. That was really interesting. So our next question is about a recent video that Cure Alzheimer's Fund produced. And you talked a little bit about COVID and its impact on research. Can you just expand on that a little bit more and say kind of where we are now with the current situation?
Sure. So there are, as we've all lived through, there have been lots of impacts of COVID. And it's been really challenging for biological based labs because it's not as straightforward as, oh, I'm going to put my pencil down when this paper that I'm writing, and I'll come back to it when my lab gets opened up again and start writing again. In some more extreme cases, institutions actually required labs to go ahead and sacrifice their animal colonies because they didn't even want people coming in to maintain the animals. When that happens, you have to restart those colonies, and it's very challenging because these animals are often transgenically engineered. These aren't like mice you could catch in your house and just suddenly start experimenting on. The same thing happened with cell lines in some cases, although in most cases, people were able to get those to maintenance levels, but starting and stopping a cell line is very challenging. You can also imagine that when you're studying a disease of aging, it's very important to do your experiments at certain time points. If you miss that window, you can't make those mice younger again. And in many cases, they're going to die off. You will not act because a mouse lifespan at best is something like 24 months and for many of the lines that we look at. So if you locked your lab down, even for 3 or 6 months, you've missed an entire stage of that mouse's life cycle. So there were all sorts of issues on the biology side, but there were also challenges just on the staffing side. We and other funding organizations often offered what are called no-cost extensions. So we said to labs, we get it, you can't get this done, we totally understand, and we'll be ready with your next tranche of funding or to review your report or what have you when you're ready for us. We want to be understanding there. But we didn't have the money to give them more money, and they needed to keep paying salaries. So many labs were forced after long enough shutdowns to actually lay off important lab workers. It's very hard to get great lab techs. And at the end of the day, although there may be a famous scientist's name on the paper or on the grant, there's a whole army of people behind them who actually make the work happen. So with many of those people laid off, not all of them could be rehired when labs reopened because they went off and found other jobs. In some cases, they had to. So what we're seeing right now is that although most labs are open again, many of them still have safety protocols in place that don't allow them to have full staff in the lab at the same time right now. So they're still not operating at full capacity. Some labs are experiencing new shutdowns. So if you've been watching what's going on in Europe and Australia and Asia, some places are actually locking back down, or at the very least, slowing back down, even if they're not fully locked down. For Cure Alzheimer's Fund, what that has meant is we funded less research last year than we had the year before. I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. And we are likely to fund less research this year than the year before COVID for the same reason. even though most labs in the United States are close to full capacity at this point, they're not fully there. And many of them are trying to restart things, and that just takes time. And they're not going to be ready for new funding until next year. What we're trying to do is make sure we have the funding ready so that the minute they're ready for us, we're ready for them. We are also funding a lot of new things this year, which is really exciting because a lot of the older projects, or the ones that we're looking for the second grant year, are waiting until next year for that. So we have more funding for brand new things than we might have otherwise. The other question for COVID, and one that Curals doesn't directly get involved in much right now, but we'll see what happens in the future, is the neurological impact of COVID. There is some data out there that suggests that people who lived through the flu epidemic at the turn of the 20th century, so the 1917 what we call the Spanish flu, although it actually originated, I believe, in Kansas, that those people were actually at higher risk of Parkinson's disease if you look at population-based epidemiological studies. We don't know yet whether people who got severe COVID and had neurological symptoms are going to be at higher risk of Alzheimer's. It would not be surprising, because anything that injures the brain and creates an insult does seem to, for the most part, increase chances of dementia. It might not be Alzheimer's dementia, however, so that's something we're going to have to explore. But I know the entire field is looking to find out here. Right now, I think a lot of the focus is how do we get people over their neurological symptoms? And we're not quite ready to spend a lot of attention on what are the long-term consequences. But I think the attention will shift there once the emergency is over. Did I answer your question?
Thank you, Meg, for talking about the various ways that COVID has really impacted AD research, and also possible research down the line, and how COVID has impacted neurological disorders and possibly AD development later on. Our next question is really about funding. So, and specifically with the new FDA approval of Aduhelm, our question is really, how does Aduhelm impact the disease onset? And also if you can discuss what this approval means for future AD research and where Alzheimer's is today.
So those are great and really hard questions. So the first one, let me go after what is Aduhelm intended to do. Aduhelm is an anti-amyloid immunotherapy. That's a long way of saying that what it intends to do is actually tag amyloid in your brain in a way that will make your immune system cells, your microglia cells in your brain, go after and digest that amyloid and clear it out of your brain so that you don't end up with amyloid plaques. It actually is intended to go after amyloid plaques themselves, so it sees the aggregated form, but there is also data to suggest that it goes after the pieces of amyloid before they aggregate into plaques. So the idea is that it will get rid of the plaques you already have and hopefully also prevent the formation of new plaques. The challenge with Aduhelm, so let me back up for a second. That's really exciting in the sense that the amyloid cascade hypothesis suggests that the first thing that happens in Alzheimer's that we need to worry about is the overproduction or underclearance or both of beta amyloid protein. And if we could do something about that, if we could prevent this tipping point idea of beta amyloid aggregation in the brain, we would be able to prevent all of the rest of the negative consequences that we see as Alzheimer's. You wouldn't end up with tau pathology. You wouldn't end up with neuroinflammation gone awry. You wouldn't end up with loss of synapses and loss of neurons. That's the concept for the amyloid cascade hypothesis. And so this would be a true preventative. It would be a way of intervening before somebody ever exhibited any cognitive symptoms whatsoever. And that's what we all want. Nobody wants to have to lose memory before you intervene, right? We want to keep our brains working the way they work now. And so in the amyloid cascade hypothesis, the idea is if you wait until, for example, tau pathology emerges, then you're waiting until you've already got cognitive symptoms. And the idea of reversing the neurodegeneration that is exhibited as cognitive symptoms is extraordinarily more challenging than preventing it in the first place. You do birth new neurons in your brain through your lifespan. You do keep creating new synapses, but we don't really know whether you could ever do that enough to reverse cognitive decline. And we certainly don't expect that once you lose a memory, you'd be able to get it back. We have no real idea if that would ever be possible. So from that point of view, Aduhelm is really, really exciting because of the intervention point that it's going after. The challenges of Aduhelm are many, though. For one thing, it's what's called an infusion therapy. You have to go sit in a chair and have an IV for about an hour once a month in order to get the therapy. There aren't enough infusion chairs in this country right now for all the Alzheimer's people who could be eligible for this. So that's one. And there are people who need them for Crohn's disease and other diseases that require infusion therapy. So that's one piece. Another issue is that there are significant side effects, particularly in people who are what are called APOE4 carriers. APOE4 is a gene variant that is the biggest driver, the biggest impact on risk for late onset classic Alzheimer's disease. That is, again, people who are getting Alzheimer's in their 60s as opposed to their 50s or 40s. People who have at least one copy of APOE4 are at higher risk of ever having an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And on average, if they do, they get it younger than people without one or two copies of APOE4. The challenge for Aduhelm and for all of the other anti-amyloid immunotherapies that have been developed so far is that people who are carriers of APOE4 are more likely to need the drug because they're more likely to get Alzheimer's, but they're also more likely to suffer significant side effects involving brain swelling and brain bleeding. In most people, you don't actually even know that it's happening. But in some people, this can be life-threatening, and it can actually, in and of itself, affect cognition negatively, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. Finally, the evidence for Aduhelm is really, really murky. When you want to bring a drug to market, you are usually required to have what are called phase 3 clinical trials. And you're usually required to have 2 of them, and they both have to be positive. And positive means you got the outcome you were trying according to the definition you established before you ran the trial. You're not supposed to get to define success after the trial is over, because then you can just cherry pick the data. So Aduhelm had 2 phase 3 clinical trials. The challenge for Aduhelm is that during the trials, they figured out that you could actually give a higher dose safely to APOE4 carriers than they originally thought you could if you did what's called titrating. You gradually increase the dose, then you could start giving a higher dose safely. But they didn't figure that out until the trials were already underway. So they changed the trial protocols with the approval of the FDA while the trials were going. But before the trials started, as part of their definition of success, they said, we're going to pick a point in time and we're going to do what's called a feasibility analysis. And we're going to say, looking at all of the data we've collected so far, statistically speaking, do we think that people could possibly be getting a benefit from this drug or not? Those 2 things ended up in conflict because the feasibility determination happened without taking into account the change in protocol. And when they did the feasibility determination, the data said nobody is benefiting from this. So they stopped both trials. But they continued to, so there's a date on which you say, we're going to use the data up to now for feasibility. And then there's the date on which you actually make the feasibility decision, because it takes time to analyze that data. Meanwhile, they were collecting data all the way up until the feasibility decision was made and they terminated. When they went back and they looked at each trial separately and they took all of the data up until the date of termination, they found that the people who got the highest dose for the longest time in one of the trials actually saw slower decline. Now, I'm speaking really slowly because there's so many caveats built into that statement. You actually really have to kind of tear it apart. These people did not see improved cognition. They did not see a stop in decline. What they saw was a 22% slowing of decline over the course of treatment. The same group of people did not see improvement in the other trial. So that data is not particularly inspiring, particularly if you are a biostatistician. Biostatisticians look at that and they say, that's just noise. That's not a signal. You can't rely on that. And the FDA did not say that that was a demonstration of clinical benefit. But what they did say was, we've decided, even though we kind of said along the way, this is the FDA, that we wouldn't do it this way, we're going to say, wow, in both trials, at every dosage, the drug really did reduce the levels of beta amyloid in the brain. And we think that that's going to predict cognitive benefit, clinical benefit over time. So we're going to say, yes, we approve this drug. Yes, people can actually get this drug, but Biogen, which is the sponsor of the drug, has to run what's called a phase 4 post-marketing confirmatory trial showing that people actually do end up with clinical benefit. The challenge there is they get 9 years to do it, and 9 years of a really expensive, potentially dangerous drug is a lot of impact on our healthcare system for a drug that may not actually end up providing clinical benefit. So that's what all the controversy is about Aduhelm. Not everybody believes that the reduction of amyloid really does predict cognitive benefit. A lot of people think 9 years is too long to be able to sell a drug without proving that. It's a very expensive drug. The drug alone is $56,000 over the course of a year at a maintenance dose. The cost of actually getting the drug will probably add about $50,000 to that on an annual basis. So you're talking about a drug that's about $116,000 a year. And on top of that, the clinical trial had very, very few people of color in it. It was an international trial, so it was done in the United States and in other countries, but something less than 2% of all participants were Black, for example. I don't have the numbers on Latino and Hispanic participants, but they were similarly low. Black and Latino people are at much higher risk of cerebrovascular issues. Cerebrovascular issues are exactly the kind of side effects we worry about with this drug. So we have real concerns about racial equity with this drug, not to mention socioeconomic equity when a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford this drug, even if it does work. If it doesn't work, a lot of people will have spent a lot of money for a drug that doesn't work. So and I just gave you a really long explanation of Aduhelm, and I think your question was also about what happens to research now that there is a drug out there. So a lot of things are happening, and some are really possibly exciting and some are very concerning. On the exciting side, this is rejuvenated interest in anti-amyloid therapies. So a lot of people are saying, okay, well, if the FDA is willing to approve an anti-amyloid therapy without making us show cognitive benefit, I can try a true prevention strategy. Because remember, if you had to run a trial that showed cognitive benefit, you can't do a true prevention trial because people don't have cognitive decline yet. So how do you show that they've benefited? You're not going to probably make them smarter. That's not really how this works. And a lot of those attempts are not going to be immunotherapies. They're going to be little white pills. And if we could have a little white pill that was a prevention intervention, that would be a lot more accessible to everybody. So that's really, really exciting. So we, for example, are funding what's called a gamma secretase modulator that we're hoping will go into clinical trials later this year. That would be a little white pill. You'd probably start taking it in your 50s or 60s. And ideally, it would prevent the amyloid cascade hypothesis or amyloid cascade from ever getting started. So there are other efforts like that out there. So that's the upside. There's also upside in if Biogen makes a lot of money from this drug, which people are expecting that they will, that will pull other investors, other biotechs, other pharmaceuticals back into Alzheimer's research. A lot of companies have lost a lot of money in clinical trials in the past that failed, and then no drug went to market. And so a lot of money left Alzheimer's research, and we really need that money to come back in. Our kind of money, not-for-profit money, is really important, but we're funding a different kind of research, for example, than clinical trials. You really want people with pharmaceutical experience getting involved because they have a really good sense of what makes a drug successful. It isn't just that it works, it also has to be tolerable. Like, can you stand to take it? Does it make you throw up every day? It can't be toxic. It can't, you can't serve your brain and kill your liver, for example. So we really need those people and their expertise and their dollars to come back in. So that's the positive on research. The negative is, what do we do about clinical trials? Usually, if there is a drug that is what you call the standard of care, if you're going to try to have another drug in the market, you have to do a clinical trial that compares your drug with the standard of care. Because why would anybody take your drug if it wasn't better than what was already out there? Well, Aduhelm is a really, really expensive drug. So if you have to give your control arm Aduhelm, that's going to make your clinical trial a lot more expensive than it would have been otherwise. Particularly if your intervention is a little white pill, how do you even have a control group that's also getting an infusion drug? Do you then have a third arm that's somehow different altogether? So that's one problem. The other is, people who are already enrolled in clinical trials know that they might be getting a placebo. They might not be getting the actual drug being tested because you need that control. The concern we have is that people will drop out of clinical trials because they want to go get Aduhelm because they want something that the FDA has approved already, rather than potentially getting a placebo. And that's going to make it a lot harder to actually enroll people in clinical trials, which is already really, really hard in Alzheimer's. We are incredibly grateful to people who participate in clinical trials with Alzheimer's, but also to their caregivers, because it's very challenging to get somebody with memory and cognitive concerns to their doctor's appointments. And adding extra doctor's appointments for a clinical trial is a really big ask for patients and caregivers.
Thank you so much. Listening to the pros and cons of the Aduhelm and all of the other clinical trials is really interesting. I think we have just one more question. So I know many people that are watching this video want to know how they can get involved to help fight Alzheimer's. So what are some ways that teens and youth in general can make a difference and support Alzheimer's disease research?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm really excited about all the different things that people can do. The biggest one that we encourage people to do right off the bat is, if your family has a history of Alzheimer's disease, encourage your family to register with your local Alzheimer's disease research center. Those are federally funded, and they have patient and family registries so that we can actually understand what the path of Alzheimer's looks like. What is the genetic risk? How does lifestyle impact that? The only way we can do those kinds of studies is if we get people enrolled and we have enough people who have risk of Alzheimer's but end up not getting it, and we can start figuring out why, or they do get it and we can start figuring out why that is. We can start understanding why they might get it younger or older, what interventions might be possible. Clinical trials often also go to those registries to try to find enrollees, so it helps the whole system. Another opportunity that a lot of people don't know about is, I bet many of, I don't know about the three of you yet, because you maybe, New York is a little slower, like Massachusetts, where I am, in getting teens licenses. But when you get your license, you have the option to say, yes, I want to be an organ donor. You may not be aware of this, but brains are actually excluded from that. In order to become a brain donor, you actually have to register separately and differently. And there's a wonderful not-for-profit that actually manages a website that allows you to register as a brain donor. And then the NIH can come along later and they will come collect the brain from somebody who has died. There's no cost to families. You can still have an open casket. It's really an extraordinary program, because the burden on families is nothing, basically. But it's incredibly important because we need all the brains we can get. I constantly talk to researchers who are trying to find brains with different profiles and they can't get a hold of them. So that's an extraordinary program, and everybody can do it, whether you have Alzheimer's in your family or not, whatever age you are. They will not collect your brain until after you die, I promise. That I really encourage people to think about that. Another thing that people can do is to advocate for research. So when you see the federal budget come around every year, it's kind of a mind-boggling document. It's a mind-boggling process. But we need our representatives in Congress, and in particular our senators, to hear from us that we really want the NIH to get great federal funding and to really support Alzheimer's research. The federal government has been a lot more invested in Alzheimer's research in the last few years than it was before, but we really need for that to continue. And it only does if people actually let their representatives know how important it is to them. And then there are other kinds of advocacy that also matter. When we think about Alzheimer's, we think about 3 different kinds of risk. One is your genetic risk. Can't do much about it. You're born with it. It's unless you have early onset risk, it's not a guarantee. Late onset Alzheimer's genes do not guarantee that you will get Alzheimer's. Early onset genes are different. They're fully penetrant. But leaving aside your genetic risk, there are risks that you can modify and risks that you can't. So even starting as a teenager, you can start working on your modifiable risk. You can start exercising, you can start eating well. That really is not about following crazy diets. It's mostly about eating things that you can recognize as food. That means an ear of corn rather than a Dorito, for example. And it means already starting to think about how to manage stress in your life, how to foster social interaction, just basic things about how to live a healthy life. It's not super complicated. But then there are risks that you can't individually modify. And those are risks that we all need to come together to advocate to do something about. For example, air pollution is a big driver of dementia. We know that. But in the conversation about the EPA setting air pollution restrictions or what auto emissions can look like and those sorts of things, we're not talking enough about the impact on the future and on how all of us will think better and have less risk of dementia if we have cleaner air. We don't talk enough about making sure that the chemicals that we allow into our food cycle and into our environment are tested in singularly and in combination to see what impact they might have on the brain. Do they cross the blood-brain barrier? At what levels? What impact do they have when they do? So a lot of the things that people are excited about in terms of environmental causes also relate very clearly back to our dementia risk and what the dementia risk will be for your generation. So I'm always really excited to see teenagers actually getting aggressive about this because it matters long-term for you, not just for the planet, but for your own health too.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today and giving us really great insight for the CaringKind community. So we're really grateful for all the work that you do to combat Alzheimer's, and we look forward to continuing to follow the Cure Alzheimer's Fund.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. It's been terrific. I feel much more optimistic about our future when I see people like you getting involved early and actively. Everybody deserves a healthy senior existence. I have the privilege of working with a number of people in their 80s and even 90s who are sharp as a tack and active and engaged. And we all deserve to become those people. And I really, really hope that with the support of CaringKind and people like you, that's where we're going to end up, so that the 3 of you don't ever worry about dementia, that this becomes a conversation that you vaguely remember, but you don't have to keep having.
Thank you.